Well, hey guys, today we're going to take a look at standard 4.3, and when I'm recording this, I'm setting this up so this is actually probably going to be your homework, but we'll probably have covered some of this in class already. So if that's the case, just kind of zoom through it until you get to the point where we have already covered, and then start from there, okay? So with that being said, let's get into it. I know you got other things to do. Today we're going to talk about Standard 4.3, which has to do with capitalism and how it impacts the United States in the late 1800s. And man, oh man, does it have huge, massive ramifications. So first of all, we have to define what is capitalism, okay? Capitalism is a system of, an economic system where you have a couple different things going on. Number one, individuals can own stuff and it's theirs. Right here I have a pair of Bluetooth headphones. They are mine, and guess what? I can do with it whatever I want. Specifically, number two, under capitalism, I can use my private property to make a profit for myself. If I want to sell these to you, I can do that. Okay? Nobody's going to come along and say you can't make a couple bucks off of selling your used Bluetooth headphones. Now, you don't have to buy it, but that's because you have private ownership even of your own money. You get to decide what to do. And number three, this is super important, the government isn't going to come along and interfere with our transaction. Okay? So let me ask you, do we live in a capitalistic society? Well, yes and no. If I want to sell my headphones, that is totally okay. I can do that, all right? However, if I decide I want to sell drugs on the side of the road, which I don't, just to be super clear, the government is going to interfere. They're going to come along and get involved in that, okay? Also, we pay taxes and all kinds of different things. So we live in a society that is capitalistic, but we're not pure capitalist. And one of the tensions that we have is figuring out what's the right amount of capitalism. And part of the reason we're trying to figure that out is because of the stuff we're going to talk about right here. Now, before the Civil War, capitalism existed. It was a thing. The government didn't get involved very much. You've got corporations running around that they're selling stock in their company, invest in my company, and someday you're going to get rich. After the Civil War, you're going to see things really, really take off. Specifically, the reason is the same reason a lot of other things in this chapter take off, and it's the railroad, okay? The government really wants to see the railroad completed, and in fact, there are several transcontinental routes that are going to be completed. And as it's completed, you're going to start to see major industries grow. The steel industry, because think about how much steel you need to lay down train track, right? And lumber. You might not think about it, but the train track goes on these wooden railroad ties. You need a lot of trees, so there's going to be an economic boom in both steel and lumber. And then coal. You got to shovel the coal to help the train move along the tracks, right? You got to burn it in the engine. So this is going to cause a huge boom, and people are starting to get wealthy. And the government's like, we're going to kind of take our hands off of this because the economy is growing. This is fantastic. Of course, the railroad brings people to the west. You've got all this free and cheap land too, and new towns grow up along the train routes. Remember, we looked at that picture of the United States at night, and you can see those straight lines dotting out in the west. That's what's going on, because these trains are going to cause the formation of new towns. Old towns continue to exist, but only if they can come up with new specialized products, right? If you don't have a specialized product and you're not near the train station, you're probably going to have you're going to become a ghost town. The railroad is also going to allow other markets that you might not even consider being directly tied to the railroad. They're going to see these things grow, like the meat market, the fish market. You say, what are you talking about? Well, all of a sudden now we can put a bunch of cattle on a train and we can ship them across the country. We can catch fish in Charleston and we can have them to Greenville before they're rotten. And that's pretty fantastic. Man, imagine what we can do with some refrigeration. The point is this. The government sees the growth. The government kind of takes its hands off and says, we're just going to let this thing happen. We're going to see what goes down. Okay? Now, because the railroads become such a driving force and everybody is making money in the railroads, everybody wants to start a railroad. Okay? It's kind of like with the internet. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, everybody's like, ooh, there's money in the internet. So everybody starts internet companies, and you have everything.com, which you still do to some degree. And eventually they go, right? Because there's so much competition. Some of the railroads are going to fail. because the prices are just too low. Think about it this way. If you have 7 different railroad companies, but you only have enough cargo for 4 of them, how do you make sure that they use your railroad and not the other guys? Well, you got to drive your prices down and or offer better services than the other guy. Well, I hate to tell you this, but the service is pretty simple. It's we're going to take your stuff from point A to point B. So it comes down to price. The problem is we can only do so much cutthroat price lowering until some of us are going to go out of business. Some of them fail. Others of them have to merge to survive. Like I grew up in Ohio. One of the big railroads that came through our town, like it was a railroad town, where we could hear the trains at night near, just a couple miles away from where we live. One of the big railroad companies was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the B&O. Okay. Well, the B&O used to be 2 different railroad companies, Baltimore and Ohio, that merged because otherwise they would have gone disappeared, right? The problem is, and I think you saw this in the video we watched, that when the railroads crashed, there's a nationwide depression. All of a sudden, all that steel that we were building and all those railroad ties with the wood that we were buying, people are starting to go out of business. This is going to be really, really, really bad. Okay, I'm not going to do the question right now, so kind of forget that. I will ask this question. So when we're talking about how much regulation is the right amount of regulation, well, we had no regulation. We had all kinds of companies start. Some of them then fail, and the entire economy crashes. So the competition's good in a way. It gives people a good product at a cheap and reasonable price. But it's also bad because when these railroads fail, you get lots of economic problems. So do we want the government to step in a little bit? Some people start to say yes. Now, some people say, we're going to make a buck no matter what the government's doing. We're going to call these people entrepreneurs. Remember we said we're going to talk about land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship? Here's the entrepreneurship, okay? A couple guys that you ought to know about. This guy who looks a little bit like Santa Claus is Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie becomes very, very wealthy because he takes a process called the Bessemer process and he brings it to the United States and he makes it happen in a large quantity. You say, what are you talking about? Well, the Bessemer process, takes iron and turns it into steel. Let me talk about this really quick. So basically what you do is you take all this iron that you've mined and you dump it in these hoppers, kind of like this thing right here, and then you superheat them, okay? You heat them to the point where all the impurities burn off. And then you take this melted, what remains, and you pour it out, and now it's steel. What he does is he builds huge yards of this thing, roofs them in Pittsburgh, right? This is why we have the Pittsburgh Steelers, because Pittsburgh becomes a huge steel town. And Andrew Carnegie says, I believe that the next century is going to be built using steel. Yes, we've got the trains, but he foresees even using it as a building material, which skyscrapers are a thing, right? So he spends all kinds of money building these huge steel yards, and he turns it into a fortune. In fact, for a little brief period, he is the richest man on the planet. He'll be overtaken by the next guy. But he is, if you converted it to today's wealth, like today's, if you accounted for inflation and all that, he would be one of the top 5 wealthiest men in the world today, okay? Because he controls the steel industry. In fact, one of the things that he does is that he says, I'm not just going to, be content to own these steel yards. He also is going to buy the steel mines, like the mines where they're digging for this, the iron mines. He's going to build the mills. He's going to buy some trains to ship them back and forth. He owns every single level of steel production. We're going to call this vertical integration because he owns, like I said, all the different levels, okay? We're going to pull it out of the ground. We're going to put it on the trains. We're going to bring it to the steel yards. We're going to ship it away, So this is vertical integration. He owns multiple stages of the production process, okay? There's also a horizontal integration process. We'll talk about that in just a minute. In fact, I'm going to stop right here, because I know my videos, if they go longer than 10 minutes, end up getting the lip sync is way off, and it bothers me even if you don't notice. So pick up here for the second half, okay?